Welcome message for the Story Atelier channel. Welcome to the Story Atelier, where we explore wonderful, inspiring, and meaningful stories together. On our channel, you'll immerse yourself in captivating tales from all genres. From life and love to mystery and deep life lessons. Every story we share is not just for entertainment, but carries powerful messages to help you find inspiration and a new perspective on the world around you. Be sure to subscribe today so you don't miss any of the amazing stories we have in store. If you enjoy the stories we share and want to help spread these valuable messages, don't forget to like and share this video with your friends. Comment below and let us know your thoughts, or suggest any stories you'd like to hear in the future. Thank you for joining the Story Atelier. Let's build a community that loves and shares meaningful stories. See you in the next story. It was a warm, bustling afternoon in the heart of downtown Springfield. The sun hung high above, casting long shadows on the pavement as the streets teemed with life. People hurried past, their footsteps quick and purposeful, while the distant hum of traffic created a constant backdrop. The occasional honking of horns and the sound of street vendors calling out to pedestrians added to the lively symphony of the city. Despite the chaos, Michael Taylor stood outside a local cafe, waiting for his lunch order. Michael, a black man in his late 30s, was dressed casually in a simple hoodie and jeans, looking every bit the part of someone enjoying a day off. He had just finished up a meeting with some clients and was treating himself to a quick meal before heading home. His phone was in his hand, his eyes absorbed in the screen as he scrolled through social media, oblivious to the growing tension around him. Across the street, Officer Mark Thompson sat inside his patrol car, watching Michael with an intensity that seemed out of place. Thompson had been on duty for over a decade, his instincts honed through years of experience. But today, something about Michael didn't sit right with him. As he watched the man standing so calmly on the sidewalk, a feeling of discomfort washed over him. He couldn't quite explain it. There was nothing overtly suspicious about Michael, but his instincts were telling him something was off. Michael was too calm, too at ease in a part of town that, in Thompson's mind, was not a place for someone like him to be so comfortable. It was a feeling he had experienced before, a feeling that something was wrong. Even when all evidence pointed to the contrary, he didn't know why, but his gut told him that Michael didn't belong there. Thompson's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he watched Michael from his car. The officer's thoughts, though not consciously racist, began to twist into assumptions. He was convinced there was something Michael was hiding. The man's quiet demeanor, the way he stood with his back straight, the way he held his phone, it all seemed off. Something didn't fit. The officer pushed open his car door, stepping out onto the street with slow, deliberate steps. His boots clicked against the pavement as he walked towards Michael. Every step felt heavier, driven by a growing sense of certainty, though he couldn't put his finger on why. As he neared Michael, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man was hiding something, perhaps even involved in some illegal activity. He just had to find out what it was. Michael looked up from his phone just as Officer Thompson reached him. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, Michael sensed the officer's gaze burning into him. Though he didn't flinch, he had been through situations like this before, often in the most mundane moments of life. In America, a black man walking through a predominantly white neighborhood, standing out of place, could often be met with suspicion. "Good afternoon," Officer Thompson greeted, his tone flat but firm. "What are you doing here today?" Michael's face remained neutral as he responded, his voice calm. "Just waiting for my lunch order," he said, nodding toward the cafe window. "Not much to it." Thompson's eyes scanned Michael's attire, his phone, and his relaxed posture. Something about this exchange didn't feel right to him, and he couldn't shake the feeling. His suspicion only deepened as he stared at Michael, whose calmness seemed almost defiant in Thompson's eyes. "I'm gonna need to see some id," Thompson said, his voice tightening slightly. There was no clear reason, no legal justification, but in his mind, Michael's presence was becoming more of an issue. His assumption that something wasn't right had only solidified. Michael exhaled, his body momentarily tensing, but he kept his tone even and respectful. "Officer, have I done something wrong?" His words were innocent, but the way Thompson's eyes narrowed suggested otherwise. "You got a problem with that?" Thompson snapped, his frustration mounting. He was no longer acting on reason, but on a deep, unshakable instinct that told him Michael was hiding something. It was as if every movement Michael made was an affront to his authority. Michael, though nervous, knew better than to provoke the officer further. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, keeping his hands visible. "I don't have a problem, officer, just wondering why you need to see my id." Thompson's anger flared, the tension in the air thickening. He wasn't listening to Michael anymore. In his mind, this wasn't about the ID, it was about making sure Michael knew his place. "Turn around," Thompson ordered, his voice harsh. Hands on the wall. Michael froze for a moment, his mind racing. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the officer's sudden shift in demeanor made his heart race. He knew the consequences of resisting in these moments. Taking a deep breath, he complied, his movements slow and deliberate as he placed his hands against the brick wall. The officer moved closer, his hand gripping Michael's arm with unnecessary force. The harshness of the situation was escalating rapidly, and Michael could feel the weight of it in his shoulder as Thompson roughly cuffed him. Michael winced at the pain, but his mind remained focused. He was used to this. He had to remain calm. One wrong move, one show of defiance, and things could get out of hand quickly. The officer was in control. Or so he thought. As Officer Thompson tightened his grip on Michael's wrist, the world seemed to slow down. Michael's shoulder throbbed with pain, and the roughness of the officer's hand against his skin sent sharp waves of discomfort through his body. But he held steady. His body was tense, but he refused to show any weakness. Not now. He had been through too much in his life to let one officer's misguided actions break his composure. The crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk seemed to swell, their murmurs a quiet backdrop to the escalating tension between Michael and Officer Thompson. Phones were raised, and though Michael couldn't see them, he could feel the weight of the onlookers' gazes. Some were confused, others shocked, but none of them were intervening. Most people, especially in this part of Springfield, knew better than to get involved in something like this. Yet Michael knew that this wasn't just about him, it was bigger than that. This wasn't just an unfortunate encounter with an overzealous officer, it was about a systemic problem that had existed for far too long. "Do you know who you're messing with?" Michael thought to himself, though he dared not speak those words out loud. If he did, he feared it would escalate the situation further. Instead, he focused on remaining calm, allowing the officer to make all the mistakes. The worst thing he could do now was give Officer Thompson any reason to act with even more aggression. Thompson, however, didn't seem to be thinking clearly. His emotions had overtaken his rationality. As Michael's hands were forced against the brick wall, Thompson's impatience grew. He yanked Michael's arm sharply, pinning him harder than necessary. The pain in Michael's shoulder intensified, but he refused to let it show. In the officer's mind, this was no longer about the rules or the law. It was about control. "You're making a mistake," Michael managed to say through gritted teeth, his voice still calm but firm. "You need to listen." But Thompson wasn't listening. The officer's mind was already made up. He had built a narrative in his head. Michael was guilty. Michael had to be guilty of something. He had been too calm, too collected. Why would anyone stand in this area without some ulterior motive? Why wasn't he nervous or scared? It was a question that haunted Thompson's mind. But the answer didn't matter. Not in his world. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" Thompson growled, his tone becoming more menacing. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You're not getting away that easy." Michael felt the pressure of Thompson's hand on his arm, forcing him against the wall. His thoughts raced. How could this be happening? He was just waiting for his lunch. How had things escalated so quickly? It wasn't supposed to be like this. But no matter how hard he tried to remind himself that he had done nothing wrong, the reality was clear. He was being treated as guilty without cause. A few moments later, Michael was shoved towards the patrol car, his twisted ankle sending jolts of pain through his leg. He stumbled but regained his balance, determined not to let this officer see the toll it was taking on him. Every step felt heavier, every movement more difficult than the last. The weight of the handcuffs around his wrists reminded him of the injustice of it all. But he held his head high. The crowd continued to watch, some of them now calling out to Officer Thompson. "Why are you doing this?" One woman shouted. "He hasn't done anything." But Thompson, lost in his own world of self-righteousness, ignored them. He was convinced that he was in the right, convinced that he was the one in control. His belief in his authority was unwavering. It didn't matter that the public was now openly challenging him. In his mind, they were just bystanders who didn't understand the situation. Once Michael was shoved into the backseat of the patrol car, the officer slammed the door shut with unnecessary force. Michael winced at the sound, but he didn't allow himself to be broken. He sat still in the backseat, his wrists aching from the tight handcuffs, his shoulder throbbing with pain. It was humiliating, but he knew better than to give Thompson the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. As the car started to move, Michael couldn't help but wonder how far this would go. He knew he was an innocent man, but how many others, without the resources or connections he had faced the same kind of mistreatment? What if he didn't have the power to turn this around? What if this was just one more incident that would fade into the background of countless others? But his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the crowd growing louder as Thompson drove off. Some of them were still shouting, still recording on their phones. Their words echoed in Michael's mind, offering a flicker of hope in the otherwise dire situation. He wasn't alone, not entirely. Thompson, however, didn't seem to notice or care. He had driven away from the scene, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. In his mind, the encounter was over, the man was arrested, and he had done his job. He had nothing to worry about. But as the car passed through the streets, the looming sense of dread that had been hanging over him began to gnaw at him. The situation wasn't as simple as he had believed. Back at the police station, Officer Sarah Morales, a young officer in the precinct, had been going about her usual duties when the arrest paperwork landed in her hands. She looked over the details, scanning the description of the suspect and the charges listed by Officer Thompson. Suspicious behavior, it said, possible theft. Morales wasn't sure what had struck her, but something about the name on the paperwork felt familiar. She glanced over at Michael, still sitting quietly in the holding area. His calm, composed presence struck her as odd. It was rare for someone to remain so calm after such an aggressive arrest. She couldn't place it, but the face seemed familiar. After a few moments, it hit her. This wasn't just any man. This was Michael Taylor, the state attorney of Springfield. Officer Sarah Morales felt her heart race as the realization hit her. Michael Taylor, the man she had just witnessed being dragged into the holding area by Officer Thompson, was none other than the state attorney of Springfield. It was like a cold slap to the face. How could she have missed it? The man sitting there, calmly nursing his bruised shoulder, was the very person responsible for the legal oversight in their city. The one whose job it was to ensure justice was served. She looked at the papers again. His name was right there, printed in black and white, Michael Taylor. She had seen him in the news, on TV, even in local events. He was well known in their community, a figure of authority, power, and respect. Morales felt the weight of her discovery sink in. She knew what this meant. Officer Thompson, in his haste and inability to control his bias, had just made a grave mistake. A mistake that wasn't just going to affect his career, it would send shockwaves through the entire department. The state attorney was in their custody, injured, humiliated, and wrongfully detained, and no matter how hard Thompson tried to justify his actions, there was no excusing what had just happened. The room around her seemed to grow darker, the weight of the situation settling in like a heavy fog. Morales stood frozen for a moment, staring at the ID that confirmed her suspicions. She could hear the faint sounds of Thompson in the back office, processing paperwork, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Her instincts told her she couldn't just stand there. She had to act. She couldn't allow this to continue. With trembling hands, she grabbed Michael's ID from the stack and hurried to the back offices. She knew what she had to do. Thompson needed to be stopped before this went any further. Thompson, Morales called, her voice sharp as she burst into the room. Thompson looked up, startled by her urgency. His expression was one of confusion. But before he could speak, Morales thrust the ID in front of him. "Do you realize who you've arrested?" she demanded, her voice tinged with disbelief. "This is Michael Taylor, the state attorney." Thompson's face drained of color as he took the ID from her hand, his eyes scanning the name. Panic began to set in as he processed the truth. His body stiffened, his breath becoming shallow. I didn't know," Thompson stammered, his voice cracking with the sudden realization of just how badly he had messed up. He was acting suspicious. And suspicious? Morales cut him off, her voice cold. He was waiting for his lunch. "Thompson, you had no reason to arrest him. You acted on assumptions, on gut feelings. And now look where we are. We have a state attorney sitting in our holding cell with a dislocated shoulder and a twisted ankle because of you." Thompson's face was a mix of disbelief and guilt. His career, his entire life's work, was crumbling right in front of him. He had just wrongfully arrested one of the most powerful people in the state. Someone whose influence could bring down an entire department. He opened his mouth to protest. But Morales wasn't having it. "There's no excuse for this. And you need to tell the higher-ups right now. We can't hide this." Without waiting for his response, Morales turned on her heel and stormed out of the office. She didn't have time to waste. The damage was already done. And now, the consequences would follow. As she walked back toward the holding area, the entire precinct seemed to buzz with the impending fallout. She could hear whispers between officers, and their faces spoke volumes. No one knew what to expect. But one thing was clear: Officer Thompson was in trouble. Big trouble. When she reached the holding area, Michael was still seated, his body stiff with the remnants of the pain from the rough arrest. His shoulder was immobilized in a sling, and his ankle was bandaged. But despite his injuries, he was still composed, his eyes unwavering as he glanced up at Morales. I just need to get out of here," Michael said, his voice steady but with a hint of frustration. "This is insane. I'm going to make sure this gets handled," Morales said softly, her tone apologetic. "What happened to you? It's not right. I'll make sure they know the truth." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't need sympathy, and he didn't want to make a scene. But the injustice of it all burned within him. It wasn't just about his arrest, it was about the system. About how easily someone could be wrongfully treated simply because of their race. How many others had faced this same situation, only without the means to expose it? "Thank you," he said quietly. "Just don't let this go unnoticed." Morales gave a tight nod and stepped out. Knowing she had to take action, she moved quickly, making her way to the office of Captain Diane Harris. Harris was the one who would need to know the full story. The one who would take the reins and decide what to do next. Captain Harris, a veteran officer with years of experience, was sitting at her desk, reviewing paperwork when Morales barged into the room. The captain's eyes flicked up, her face already hardening at the sight of the younger officer's tense posture. "Morales, what's going on?" she asked, her voice measured but with an edge. "It's bad, Captain," Morales replied, placing the ID on Harris's desk. "Thompson arrested the state attorney, Michael Taylor." Harris blinked in shock. Her face went pale as she processed the information. What do you mean he arrested the state attorney?" Morales took a deep breath. Thompson's actions were reckless. He wrongfully detained Taylor, used excessive force, and now we have a lawsuit on our hands. His injuries were documented, and there's video footage of the arrest circulating. "This is huge, Captain." Harris's jaw tightened as she read the ID. Her mind racing, the weight of the situation crashed down on her, and for the first time in her career, she felt the true depth of the consequences of one officer's actions. "I'm calling the chief," Harris said, her voice firm. "This has to be addressed immediately. We cannot allow this to spiral out of control." As the situation unfolded, word of Michael Taylor's wrongful arrest spread like wildfire. Protesters took to the streets, demanding justice for the state attorney and calling for reforms in the police department. Video footage of Officer Thompson's actions had gone viral, and the public was outraged. The legal team surrounding Michael Taylor worked tirelessly, building a case that would hold not only Thompson accountable but also shed light on the broader issues of racial bias and police misconduct. In the end, Officer Thompson was fired. His career was destroyed, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. But for Michael Taylor, this wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that what had happened to him would never happen to anyone else again. He was determined to use his position of power to reform the system from within, fighting for those who didn't have the same platform or resources. Though his physical pain slowly faded, the battle for justice was just beginning.